Здравейте, аз съм Диана Малеева. Някога се борих да печеля тенис мачове по световните кортове. Днес обаче съм в битката за климата. Добре дошли в Градус, мястото, където ще разговаряме с изключителни гости от различни области, за да разберем заедно колко е важно да действаме сега за бъдещето ни. Защото всеки градус, всеки разговор, всеки ден има значение. Надявам се на Градус да ви вдъхнови и да действаме заедно. Този подкаст е резултат от работата на групата на анонимните климатици, която се събира през последните няколко години, за да води разговор и да търси отговори за климата. Повече информация за Градус и за анонимните климатици ще откриете в Горичка.bg. Излъчваме го в партньорство като част от платформата на Dir.bg за диалог, идеи, търсене и намиране на зелени решения Green Transition. Здравейте, приятели! Днес ми е особено приятно, защото такъв подкаст до сега не съм записвала. Ще си говорим за 61-та пленарна сесия на Междуправителствения панел за промени в климата или накратко казано IPCC. Може би някои от вас знаят какво е IPCC, но аз все пак ще обясна. IPCC е органа към ООН, който отговаря за това да събере и анализира всички научни данни, които са свързани с промените в климата. В него участват 195 държави и стотици учени. И те пишат едни такива дълги и големи доклади, които анализират тази информация и след това от тази информация тя трябва да се превърне в препоръки към държавите и към света за това как да се справя с промените в климата и какви са решенията. Това е едно огромно, наистина научно усилие. Ако отворите Уикипедия, там пише, че това е най-големия peer review научен процес. Обаче най-якото е, че тази сесия утре започва в София. И в София ще пристигнат повече от 500 делегата и те ще се съвещават, ще имат конференции следващите няколко дни. Те са в затворени врати и това полага стратегическата основа на следващия 7-годишен доклад, който мисля, че трябва да приключи през 2028 или 2029. Доколкото разбирам, в този доклад трябва да има много конкретни насоки за това градовете какво трябва да правят. Но най-якото от всичко е, че аз в моя подкаст днеска ще си говоря с Диана Юрге Форзац, която е заместник-председател на IPCC от миналата година и тя е естествено много яка учена и тя е в момента е професор в Департамента по екологични науки и политики в Централноевропейския университет. Но освен това има докторска степен от Калифорнийския университет и всъщност тя е участвала в писането и оценката на 2 такива доклада до сега. И нейната голямо желание е било точно в Източна Европа да се проведе тази пленарна сесия и това, че такова събитие от такъв мащаб се случва в София е супер, защото все повече хора ще научат за климатичните промени, повече политици ще научат за това и е много важно българската научна общност да бъде включена в този процес. И за това аз днеска ще си говоря с Диана и от тук нататък разговор започва на английски. Hello, Diana. Welcome to Bulgaria. I am just a climate activist, have been for many years, and I'm a little bit honored to be able to be talking to someone like you. I've spoken to some Bulgarian scientists, but never with a scientist from the IPCC and never to vice president of the IPCC. So I'm truly impressed. So I have made a bit of an introduction about the IPCC and what it is, but please tell us a little bit more about your work with the IPCC.
Thank you very much. First, I want to thank you for this opportunity because it's really exciting to be able to be talking to you and through you to the Bulgarian audience and enthusiasts. It's also a really amazing thing for me to be here because I'm also from Eastern European. Why I am the vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'm from Eastern Europe, so it's really nice to have the opportunity to get and bring the IPCC closer to more Eastern Europeans. So, as you already introduced, just to reiterate a little bit, so our job is to assess the science related to climate change, because sometimes it could be seen as controversial or sometimes too complex. So what we do is trying to put all of that together in a way so that decision makers can also act and know how to navigate this very, very complex and really burgeoning amount of scientific material by now. For example, in the last cycle, we have reviewed and assessed over 100,000 scientific papers and tried to, even though our reports are also long, because in the last cycle, which means in the previous cycle, in the so-called sixth assessment report, we produced over 10,000 pages. Nevertheless, we have many short summaries of this. So in the end, we do condense this into short summaries, which are also digestible for policymakers as well as potentially also for the public in really what do we know about climate change and what do we know about what can we do about it.
And you do these special reports.
Exactly. So our most important activity is to produce the so-called assessment reports, which so far we have produced 6 of them, and they last roughly 7 years. However, within such a cycle, and we work in these cycles to produce these so-called assessment reports, we try to assess everything about climate change, socioeconomic and technical and scientific as well. But we also do so-called special reports on topics which are really important. So far we have done 14 of these special reports on topics including, for example, 1.5 degree global warming. We have done on oceans and the cryosphere, on the land. Cryosphere means ice, so the oceans and ice. Also land. So there are many different topics, and we are here to approve another special report, which we are hopefully going to do on cities. Everybody is very excited about, or most of us live in European cities. So it's really that will bring us again all of this closer to people, what we can do in cities. In addition, we also produce guidelines for governments on how to report their activities and emissions, what cause climate change. So these are the primary things that the IPCC does.
That's quite amazing. So it's quite amazing that this is happening in Sofia. So there is a new cycle starting now, and it will start tomorrow.
Basically, the cycle started exactly a year ago today, because that's when we had the elections for the new bureau. But in a sense, it is true that this is our second so-called plenary meeting in the cycle. The plenary meeting is when all the governments meet and tell the scientists what kind of work would be really most useful in this cycle. For example, we do together the content of our reports. This is why the IPCC has been so powerful and so successful, this knowledge co-production. Because very often scientists write fantastic reports, but they, are difficult to understand or they are, not exactly or not necessarily reach the governments. Here, what we do is we ask the questions together with the governments, with the policymakers. Then the scientists work on their own. The governments and experts provide their comments or reviews but it's in the hand of the scientists. But at the end, we also phrase the summaries together, which is really a powerful tool because first, it also creates ownership in the government and decision makers. So nobody can say after this, no, my scientists say something else. So in the international negotiations, the IPCC reports are the fundamental basics, the scientific basic of all international negotiations because all governments have accepted them who are part of the IPCC and this process. But also this co-production process helps us write reports or summaries which are more understandable and also more relevant for what policymakers are interested in. So this is why our model, this IPCC model, since then has been taken up by many other areas, like biodiversity has also adopted this, and many chemicals and so on. Also, many countries are adopting this model, the IPCC model. And I believe that this is one of the strong contributors why, in the end, we were also awarded the Shell Nobel Peace Prize in 2007, because these ingredients formed the success of how we were able to influence, in the end, the global awareness about climate change and the global processes.
In Bulgaria, the last 2 weeks were very hot, but not only in Bulgaria, but everywhere in Eastern Europe. I live a little bit here in the mountain and we don't have air conditioning. And for the first time, we couldn't sleep during the night. Even the kids couldn't sleep and we were taking showers during the night. So a lot of scientists are sounding the alarm. And some of them are saying that this might be the coolest summer for the rest of our lives. Is that so?
Well, of course, we can never say about an individual event. However, what we do see that unfortunately heat waves are becoming significantly more frequent. They are longer in duration and also more intensive. And in a sense, this I also use this meme often, this joke that as a good illustration of the trends that yes, it in a hot heat wave that it may actually have been one of the coolest of the rest of our lives. Of course, it's not literally true, but if we look at what our reports say, is that the heat waves, which so far happened just twice a century, even in a 2-degree scenario, but if we warm, let's say, 4 degrees, then they will happen about 80 times a century. So significantly more frequently. And also, they will be more than 5 degrees hotter each time. So in that scenario, yes, unfortunately, that would definitely be what happened now could still be among the not so extreme temperatures yet. Or we still have the opportunity to actually prevent that and maintain or keep warming at hopefully 1.5 degrees centigrade.
Can you please explain to me? I think a lot of people do not understand what is the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees.
Exactly.
For me, it became relevant when I thought of my kids' fever. So there is quite a big difference whether they have 38 fever or 38.5 or 39. That's quite a big difference between 38 and 39. And 39.5 is when I call all my friends or doctor. So when you talk about how often heat waves will happen, it's probably relevant for 1.5 and 2 degrees, how the world will change even for something that seems not so much for the general public.
Exactly. Since the listener may be wondering why we worry about even just 1 degree of global warming, since so far the world has only warmed 1.2 degrees of centigrade as compared to the pre-industrial average. Nevertheless, as you very well said, even that seemingly little temperature difference is already very important and already brings much stress in our societies and economies. And for that, to put that into context, it's important to understand that what our report showed is that already this little temperature increase is unprecedented for 125,000 years. So the Earth has not had such a warm period for 125,000 years. That means all of civilization has never seen these temperatures. And in fact, if we look at carbon dioxide concentrations, which we see that they determine then future temperatures, they have not been so high for 2 million years. So even this little change is already very significant as compared to all of the history of humanity and especially, I think, civilization. So being really used to how our food system, has evolved, what we eat, where we produce what we eat, where we have our wealth, where we have our cities. All of this has evolved to a very quite stable climate. And then coming back to your question,
what's the difference? What's the big deal between I'm just going to make this comment that when the Paris Agreement was reached, some environmental people were happy, some were not so happy. But my work or everything I do in my life, it involves group of people. And to reach a consensus in a group of people, it's quite a big achievement. So actually to achieve this consensus between 195 countries, to me, it looks almost an impossible task. So I just sometimes reflect on that and think it's quite a big achievement. So why should we fight so much for 1.5 and why not just be more relaxed and go to 2? What's the difference?
Yes, I absolutely agree with you in that the landmark achievement of the Paris Agreement. And in fact, that year was very special because the Paris Agreement followed already 2 other very significant such UN agreements. First, the so-called Sendai framework for disaster reduction. It was also very important. Then followed by the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, which also phrased very important goals, how to achieve sustainability. And then gave the Paris Agreement. So yes, that year marked really a major opportunity for the whole world to move forward together in these sustainable directions. So what's the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees? Our report, which actually the Paris Agreement asked the IPCC to prepare a report then on 1.5 degrees, because at that time the science wasn't that ready yet. So a lot of science was actually written after the Paris Agreement to really look at, okay, what does it take for us to get there? What will be the impacts? What are the differences? And in fact, if we look at that report, we see that if we look at the difference between 1.5 degree global warming and 2 degrees global warming, and we look at the world map, actually it is the Mediterranean region, one of the most affected one. That's where you see among the biggest differences between these two impacts. For example, water availability in southern Europe is going to be very importantly affected by just this 0.5 degree difference, more than most places in the world. So we also show that in our previous report that Southeastern Europe will be one of the first to reach the hard limits of adaptation with regard to, for example, water availability and perhaps other limits with regard to heat, being able to adapt to heat waves. In Europe, among the most vulnerable, because this region also produces, Southern Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean produces a lot of the food for Europe. So the agriculture sector, is very, vulnerable, and the availability of water is very much affected in this, area by just this 0.5 degree climate change. So certainly it's, very important for this region also to contribute to, trying to keep that temperature goal.
So have you met many politicians?
Certainly very much our job is to talk to many politicians. And last week I was in the high-level political forum in the UN, and okay. 2 weeks ago, Hungary has now the presidency, so I talked on behalf of IPCC to all the ministers of environment in all Europe.
They will make Europe great again. So
yes.
So in Bulgaria, we had a very a period of political elections almost every 3 months. It has been the last 2 years. We're quite tired of elections. And unfortunately, in the last elections, most political parties did not even mention climate change. Even the ones that we vote for didn't mention it much, unfortunately. Some political parties, most, were talking about the revision of the European Green Deal, even though it looks like with the new European elections, like the Green Deal will be moving forward, nothing can really stop it. We had a lot of populist political discourse where they were, if they were in power, they were going to revise it and so on. So we, as climate activists and just people who work in climate, we are quite discouraged sometimes in Bulgaria because of this situation. How can we, as citizens of Bulgaria, is there anything we can do to help change this narrative? Do you have a magic wand, or can you give us just something we can all do to change this narrative?
Well, certainly there are many things that the IPCC assesses and says are very relevant for such situations when priorities, national or regional priorities, are not. So climate change isn't the top national or regional priority, since still the majority of countries are still struggling with many other development issues, poverty alleviation or jobs or economic development. And for the majority of the voters in the majority of the countries, these are the top priorities. So what we do is first to look at many opportunities where the two can be done together. So what are the synergies between, for example, sustainable development goals? So how can we actually reach development objectives but climate change objectives at the same time? So that's one, and I can give a couple of examples how how we don't necessarily need to prioritize climate change and still progress with climate change agendas, because in the end we are talking about more livable cities, for example, or more more affordable energy. Or energy bills, not necessarily energy prices, but more affordable energy bills, so that people in the end listen or pay lower bills. Or more food security, and so that means not being exposed to increasing food prices and so on. So most people are or better health, for example. Health is a very important issue. So of course there are very few people who would disagree that these are important. So what we can see how we can advance these and at the same time perhaps solve climate change. So that's one important aspect, because there are many choices that we can make and governments can make, which make people's lives better, and at the same time also address climate-related priorities. For example, better public transport systems, more walkable cities, and more access to active mobility, meaning bicycling and so on. How better diets, or just observing more the nationally advised healthy dietary recommendations can actually not only yes, they also reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but at the same time they also improve the people's health very much. So there are many such areas where I don't think any government can say, no, that's not important for me. And at the same time, we also advance climate change priorities. So that's one. But the second really important issue that we say about this is that the way how we need to make these changes is to observe just transition principles. So that means we do need to include everyone in the discussions. So if there are concerns, we do need to listen to them and involve everyone in the process of deciding about how what policies need to be brought. And if we observe the principles of just transition and inclusivity, then we will arrive at policies which will be much less controversial and which everyone feels ownership about such policies, and also which will help transitions. There will always be still some losers, but in such processes, we can make sure that in the end we arrive at solutions that are the most just towards societies.
Will you be meeting any politicians while you're here?
We will have high-level speakers at our opening ceremony, definitely. So the Bulgarian ministries are also, in the end, they invited the IPCC here. So we are really privileged that, first of all, that we are here and they are coming to us and exchanging views with us and meeting with our leaders and with the scientists. But otherwise, we have a very busy agenda. Yes. Because this will be a very important meeting, so we are focusing on what we have to do in the next week.
So in Bulgaria, it seems like sometimes we tend to be quite negative. We think that not enough people take climate change seriously, but actually the latest surveys from the European Commission, or there is one by the European Investment Bank, I actually see such surveys every year, and the latest one said that 89% of people do consider climate change a serious problem. And 50% of the people say they have already experienced negative effects of climate change. I was quite surprised to see that, but it seems like most people do not understand what they can do about it, or how is this relevant to their, or what changes can they make in their homes or in their daily lives in order to adapt to climate change. Do you have any recommendations for these people?
Absolutely. And I think the first thing to definitely do is to talk about it more and exchange with each other different experiences, and listen to, for example, your podcast, or listen to this podcast and then talk about it with their friends and colleagues and at work and so on. Because certainly just exchanging the experiences and the knowledge that we already have the opportunities how to adapt, or how to reduce the emissions, or how to adapt to the impacts of climate change are all, we have the knowledge, but it's certainly not so easy for people to access these, to be aware of these. So So our reports are primarily for governments. Yes. So we don't go very much into the details of the everyday people, what people can do in their everyday lives. Nevertheless, in this last cycle, we had for the first time a chapter which was called Energy Demand and Services. So meant basically how people use energy and materials, which affects, in the end, the emissions. And here we did relate to really important questions that people also have. For example, many people ask the question, I'm so little, so what difference does it make if I make any change in my life? So our report now put the science together on this, what the science says on that question, and it's very, very interesting. So what we show is that individual action, or what people actually choose to do, can make a tremendous difference. So what we show is that if all people make right decision and the right choices, we could reduce emissions by as much as 70%, so by more than 2/3. Nevertheless, if it's only just us now, everybody now after listening to this podcast and suddenly then, okay, now I'm trying to do everything right, that alone would not be enough, because then all we could do is probably not more than reducing 5% of the emissions. Because what we show is that we need so-called systemic change to enable our right lifestyle choices. So that means that, for example, in order for us to really go, for example, commute by bicycle, for that we need safe bicycle lanes and, let's say, safe bicycle parking infrastructure. However, if there is a change that these are given, and also the society starts to change towards that, right? If it's a convenient choice that I also see around me, then suddenly it's much easier to make that decision than if you have to cycle on a very heavily driven bus lane and you're competing with the buses. Equally, for example, dietary choices. Sometimes it's not so easy to just say, okay, I will be eating less meat or do more, try to be vegan. If it's more expensive, it's not a lot of people doing around you, if you're not used to what recipes to choose. However, if there is a systemic change, which means in general, societally, we encourage healthier diets. So, for example, some of the examples that we bring in our report, if, let's say, in cafeterias, the A menu is always, let's say, a plant-based menu, and it's always the B menu or it's more. So you still do have the choice, but if we nudge, we nudge people to make the right choices, and it's equal, it costs equal, and it's tasty and it's appetizing, more and more people will choose that. So if we achieve this systemic change, that the sustainable choices are easy and attractive and potentially also equally affordable, then we could reach up to 70% emissions. So then one could conclude that, until the systemic change happens, I shouldn't do anything because it's not worth it. But it's a little bit, but it's just the opposite. Because in order for us to or to achieve systemic change, we need to show leaders, both governmental, local decision makers, industrial decision makers, that this is the choice, this is the systemic change we want. And in order to do that, we have what we identified from the scientific literature. We have 5 different roles to contribute to that change. Usually we only think about our own lifestyle, but in fact we have many other ways. So what we purchase, but that's one very important role, but we have 4 other important roles in which we do influence this systemic change. So beyond being just a conscious consumer, we also are all influencers. Now, for example, what you are doing, of course, you are, clearly, or I would say, what we call them role model, not influencer, but role models. You are clearly a very important influencer through this podcast. But in fact, all of us are role models to some extent because we are parents. We are perhaps bosses in our work. We also post on social media, many of us. In all of this, we have an influencer role. And if we are conscious of that, with anything that we as a parent, as a boss, and as a social media presence, we do also influence the climate, and we should be aware of that. What we post, for example, if you choose to post about our distant vacation, our flying, then it's the wrong.
I'm actually ashamed to catch the plane now, so.
No. That's not the point to be ashamed, but simply we have a choice. Exactly. We have a choice what we show. Oh, I had this fantastic, not so distant, vacation around here. And, in fact, there is a nice new trend also about staycations or whatever. So we have a choice what we post about. So that's the second. But in fact, probably most listeners of this podcast have the most important role as a professional.
Yes, they choose to work.
Exactly. They choose to work somewhere. And in their work, they have many opportunities. Every decision they make may influence, in the end, the climate, what their company does, what their organization does, and so on. So and very often in that role, they have a bigger impact on emissions or even adaptation to climate change than necessarily in their private life. So what's important to understand that climate action doesn't start when we leave our work, but most often, and also that's a shorter time of our life. In fact, we spend most of our time, awake in time in our work. So that's a really important place where we can influence. So the other two is we are also investors because we have bank accounts. We have
pension funds.
Exactly. And that's also an important choice. And what's
the fifth?
Oh my goodness. I always remember fifth, and now it went. So the consumer, the influencer, the professional, the investor, and I'll remember that tonight. I say the fifth, but even these four yes, of course, we have been actually talking about. The fifth is we are citizens. Okay. So as citizens, now, for example, the European Parliament elections, or whenever elections come, local elections, it's a good idea to always check our different options, which of those whom we consider voting anyway, who would serve also sustainability priorities. But not only as voting, but also, we can always write letters to our representatives, or any other way, or a referenda and so on. So we should just exercise our role as citizens to influence these processes. Europe has a very advanced democracy, so we have very, very many opportunities to influence that. So if we exercise all these five roles, then we have a lot of
this
opportunities.
Is really a very, very interesting answer, because it gives you, since many of us are a bit frustrated, this gives you a very clear guidelines on what you can do on an individual level. Actually, when I started Gurichka, I thought I can only control what I do, so I'm going to recycle, bike, not buy too much stuff, and so on. And my guilty conscience was quite happy. Unfortunately, later on, I learned that this narrative doesn't really help, where individuals are made to feel guilty for their actions. And as long as there is no systemic change, we'll all feel like trapped and like we don't see hope in what we can do. And then around 2018, I was reading some stuff by Catherine Hayhoe.
Yes.
I really love her because really thanks to her, I started talking a lot about climate change again, because she said the number one thing everyone can do is talk about it. And then the other thing she said about the degrees, she said every degree every
fraction of a degree matters.
Every fraction of a degree matters, and these are like my mantras, and that's why I am still motivated to do what I do, even though 24 years later, after 98, when I read the first Lester Brown books, things are much worse. So
they are much worse, but they are also much better. I think that's another problem, that we are not emphasizing enough also the positive changes. So it's what we also show in our report, that just in the past few years, we have achieved quite a lot, even though, yes, emissions are still increasing, which is a problem, but they are increasing slower than they would have. For example, we also see that renewable energy, especially solar energy, has become much cheaper than before. In fact, they just in a matter of a decade, the prices for this have come down by more than 95%. And by now, solar energy is the cheapest source of energy in a large majority of the world. And as a result, we actually do see that also the adoption of renewable energy has been increasing very significantly. For example, in my country, in just 3 years, we tripled the solar energy capacity in Hungary. And what we see is that, and with that, Hungary has become the third country in the world to already with having the highest share of solar energy in electricity production. So in many countries have been achieving very important advances, but we somehow don't talk about this very much. Also, we have seen a very significant decrease in the cost of batteries. Yes. Also, electric vehicles. We may achieve cost parity soon between electric vehicles and gasoline-based vehicles. So, I think it's also really important to emphasize that just during the 6th assessment cycle, that it's basically 7 years, when we started that cycle, we still projected climate pathways that could have brought us to 6 degrees centigrade global warming towards the end of the century. By the end of our cycle, basically those pathways have been deemed as almost impossible already, and we are much more likely to head between 2.32 and 3 degrees, in the worst case, perhaps 4 degrees. But we have already, just in the last couple of years, excluded the worst case climate scenarios. Yes, we are far from ideal yet, but I think we do have to recognize that we have come a long way, and what you're doing has actually been making a difference, and also our work. So hopefully, if it's being communicated, in the end, we are all making a difference. And yes, we still cannot just lean back and relax, because the majority of the work is left. But we already know how to do it. Yes. We have the means. We know it's not going to break the bank. The IPCC shows that even implementing the most ambitious climate scenarios is not going to be have more significant reduction in consumption than, for example, COVID had. So, in fact, probably less than that. So, in the end, we know we can do it. So we just need to be trustful, and we need to focus on the opportunities which actually also make people's lives better.
I'm going to believe you.
Very nice. Thank you.
So, do you ever engage in talks with skeptics? Or, for example, I have started refusing debates on TV with people who say climate change is a hoax. I don't think it helps anyone to confirm this conspiracy. So, but anyway, in these surveys about Bulgaria, again, they show that only 6% of people think that this is a conspiracy, which I was surprised. Do you have a recipe on how to talk to such people? Or I thought if they're only 6%, we maybe just let them be and not talk to them at all.
Well, exactly. I think the majority of the people are now clear in Europe and also in Bulgaria and in Eastern Europe that the evidence is clear. You know, the IPCC has shown based off in the last cycle 100,000 papers that there is no question anymore that not only there is the climate is already changing. And I think the majority of the people feel it, as you said also from the survey, the majority of people have already been experiencing impact. We also know very clearly the evidence is clear that the vast majority of this change is due to human activities. So there is no question anymore about this. So the evidence is clear and our reports give very clear answers to these questions. So anyone still having any scientific doubts can clearly consult our reports where we put different lines of evidence to show how actually humans are responsible for climate change from different scientific methods, how we can show it still very clearly understandable. I'm not a physical climate scientist, but for me, some of these figures are very, very clear and I use them in my teaching or public speeches a lot. And also, that we are responsible, but also that we can still, control climate change at levels to which we can still adopt. And I think this is what is really important, that it's not, the question is whether we are responsible or not. We have a problem and we know we can do something about it. And so the solution is in our hand. And I think it's a really important message for everyone that we all can do together a better world. But for that, we need cooperation among countries.
Yes, that's the only way we can get out of this, if we cooperate and stop blaming each other.
Exactly, yes.
So we will try to end in a positive note. I was wondering, how do you talk to young people? Or if you see discouraged young people who, obviously the data is pretty bad, still emissions are still not coming down, even in the positive sense, we're going over 2 degrees, which might lead to a lot more wars and so on. There is quite a big chance of this happening. Not enough resources for people, for food and water and so on. What do you say to young people?
So there are a couple of things that I want to say to this really important question. First, yes, there is a perception that, we have already, left 1.5 degrees, this goal, and it's because a lot of media has been reporting on this. Nevertheless, it's important to understand that these climate temperature goals are measured in long time averages, since anyway, every year is different. We always had cooler years and warmer years. And so just because even if the last 13 months in a row have been always hottest and they have exceeded many, many temperature records, so far we have not yet exceeded our magic 1.5 degrees target. We may exceed it in the early 2030s. That's what we are, or we may be reaching it in the 2030s. We are likely to be reaching it, but we still the science still shows that we can still keep it that way. So we don't necessarily exceed or reach 2 degrees at all. It's really up to us. And the future is really in our hands and we have the opportunity. And yes, globally emissions are increasing. On the other hand, there is also, it may be actually, we are maybe peaking. We don't know yet, but it could be. On the other hand, it's also important to understand that more than 18 countries have already managed to reduce consistently their emissions while growing their GDPs, their economies significantly. We also show this. So, yes, globally, of course, it's much more difficult for many of the countries which are just experiencing, who are just giving access to wastewater treatment, or which are just building up their roads and their buildings and their railways and their infrastructure. Nevertheless, many developed countries have been able to actually consistently reduce their climate warming emissions while still making people's lives consistently better over decades. So that's not. It's an important message. So how to talk to young people? It's such an opportunity to talk with young people, and we also try with the IPCC to engage much with the youth, because they are tremendously enthusiastic. And also here, the key is what I mentioned earlier with writing the Green Deal or whatever. So what our reports say is include them. So be inclusive. If the youth are also included in processes, if they are also considered as an important stakeholder, they are listened to, then they feel more powerful. Because often the problem is that young people, if you look at the 5 roles that we just had, yes, they are consumers, but they often don't have a lot of money yet, or it's the parents who make the decision. Yes, they are influencers, perhaps that's the only thing. They are not yet professionals, so they can't make a difference. And they are not yet citizens. They don't have voting rights yet. They are not investors yet because they don't have pension funds or their own bank accounts. So they, of course, feel powerless. So if we empower them by at least engaging with them and including them in the processes, if we have youth representatives, for example, I just know that European Commission is considering a commissioner for the future generations, or there are many different processes, many different ways how we can engage with the youth and empower them to also be included in the different processes. Then I think if they feel agency, if they feel part of the process, they are not going to be so disappointed, and they will feel more powerful, and they will also see that there is a lot of action happening, and they have influence on the processes which very much determine their future. Of course, they are going to be the ones most affected by our decisions now. And this is why we really need to involve them and engage them in the different processes and the decisions.
I tend to think that it's our generation that bears the biggest responsibility, because very often people from our generation say, oh, the young have to be ecologically educated. They're the ones that are going to change the world. But I feel like it's if we don't do the changes now with our generation, we are leaving for them a very difficult situation.
Yes, we certainly, as you also mentioned before, it's always bad to put the blame on anyone, and yes, definitely we shouldn't shift the responsibility to the youth, especially because they, out of these 5 roles, they have very little. And certainly it's our generation, if we look at, have the most agency in all the 5 roles, right? We are in professionals, usually we are in the top of our careers most of the time. So we have a lot of influence, a lot of agency, a lot of power. Also, perhaps this, our generation has perhaps the most financial resources to invest and so on. So definitely we have but I wouldn't put it as responsibility, but opportunity, because as we say in the IPCC, every choice matters. So just like you said, every fraction of a degree matters. Every choice matters. Everybody, almost every minute, are taking decisions which have an impact on climate. Certainly, our generation may have are taking decisions which have even more impact on the climate, or how to adapt, or how we mitigate than others. But definitely, let's look at these as enormous opportunities, because that means the decisions are, we can have a big influence. I think another important thing is to just not blame ourselves for everything. Nobody can fight a war on every front. So if we all identify where we can have the most impact and use science for informing and through you who are, through mediators who translate our more complex science for the everyday people, but who are faithful to the science and who are credible in this, listening to them and translating the science for their actions and their decisions. Yes, then we can have major opportunities for making changes.
I hope you're right. Thank you very much for being my guest. I was really honored to be able to talk to you. I wish you very good stay in Bulgaria, and I wish you that with the next report you're going to say that emissions are going down. So thank you, and have a good stay and good work in Sofia.
Thank you very much, and thank you for doing this, because as we just talked about, this is such an important thing that you're doing, and for us it has been really a privilege to be able to share the work of the IPCC with the Bulgarian audience, and we hope that all of you are going to be able to make sense of our work and use our work for making our planet a better place to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.